Welcome to the new video seminary. Here is Dr. Hoffman. Subscribe and give me likes. Let's start now.
As discussed in previous part, international trade can be mutually beneficial to the nations engaged in it. The Ricardian model of international trade, developed in last part, illustrates the potential benefits from trade. In that model, trade leads to international specialization, with each country shifting its labor force from industries in which the labor is relatively inefficient to industries in which it is relatively more efficient. Because labor is the only factor of production in that model, and it is assumed that the labor can move freely from one industry to another, there is no possibility that individuals will be hurt by trade. The Ricardian model thus suggests not only that all countries gain from trade, but also that every individual is made better off as a result of international trade, because trade doesn't affect the distribution of income. In the real world, however, trade has substantial effects on the income distribution within each trading nation, so that in practice the benefits of trade are often distributed very unevenly. There are two main reasons why international trade has strong effects on the distribution of income. First, resources can move immediately or without cost from one industry to another, a short-run consequence of trade. And second, industries differ in the factors of production they demand. A shift in the mix of goods that country produces will ordinarily reduce the demand for some factors of production while raising the demand for others, a long-run consequence of trade. For both of these reasons, both of these consequences, international trade is not as unambiguously beneficial as it appeared in the Ricardian model. While trade may benefit a nation as a whole, it often hurts significant groups within the country in the short run and potentially, but to a lesser extent in the long run. Consider the effects of Japan's rice policy. Japan allows very little rice to be imported, even though the scarcity of land means that rice is much more expensive to produce in Japan than in other countries, including the United States. There is little question that Japan as a whole would have a higher standard of living if free imports of rice were allowed. Japanese rice farmers, however, would be hurt by free trade, while the farmers displaced by imports could probably find jobs in manufacturing or services. They would find changing employment costly and inconvenient. The special skills they developed for rice farming would be useless in those other jobs. Furthermore, the value of the land that the farmers own would fall along with the price of rice. Not surprisingly, Japanese rice farmers are vehemently opposed to free trade in rice, and their organized political opposition has counted for more than potential gains from trade from the nation as a whole. So a realistic analysis of trade must go beyond the Ricardian model to models in which trade can affect income distribution. Today, we focus on the short-run consequences of trade on the income distribution when factors of production can't move without cost between sectors. To keep our model simple, we assume that the sector switching cost for some factors is high enough that such a switch is impossible in the short run. Those factors are specific to a particular sector. So our learning goals today are: understand how a mobile factor will respond to price changes by moving across sectors. Explain why trade will generate both winners and losers in the short run. Understand the meaning of gains from trade when there are losers. And we also will discuss the reasons why trade is a potentially continuous issue, and explain the arguments in favor of free trade despite the existence of losers. The specific factors model was developed by Paul Samuelson and Ronald Jones. Like the simple Ricardian model, it assumes an economy that produces two goods and that can locate its labor supply between the two sectors. Unlike the Ricardian model, however, the specific factors model allows for the existence of factors of production besides labor. Whereas labor is a mobile factor that can move between sectors, these other factors are assumed to be specific. That is, they can be used only in the production of particular goods. There is the relationship between labor input and output of clothes, for example. The larger the input of labor for a given capital supply, the larger will be output. The slope of QC in the graph represents the marginal product of labor. That is the addition to output generated by adding one more person hour. However, if labor input is increased without increasing capital as well, there will normally be diminishing returns, because adding a worker means that each worker has less capital to work with. Each successive increment of labor will add less to production than the last. Diminishing returns are reflected in the shape of the production function QC. Gets flatter as we move to the right, indicating that the marginal product of labor declines as more labor is used. And be careful, diminishing returns to a single factor doesn't imply diminishing returns to scale when all factors of production are adjusted. Thus, diminishing returns to labor is entirely consistent with constant returns to scale in both labor and capital. On the right, you see the marginal product of labor. This figure shows the same information a different way. Here we directly plot the marginal product of labor as a function of the labor employed. A similar pair of diagrams can represent the production function for food. These diagrams can then be combined to derive the production possibility frontier for the economy. And be careful here, the marginal product of labor in the cloth sector, equal to the slope of the production function shown in the left figure, is lower the more labor the sector employs. Let's ask now how much labor will be employed in each sector. To answer this, we need to look at supply and demand in the labor market. The demand for labor in each sector depends on the price of output and the wage rate. In turn, the wage rate depends on the combined demand for labor by food and clothes producers, in our example. Given the prices of clothes and food together with the wage rate, we can determine each sector's employment and output. If we have two sectors only, then the wage rate W must be the same in both of them, because the assumption that labor is freely mobile between sectors. That is, because labor is a mobile factor, it will move from the low wage sector to the high wage sector until wages are equalized. The wage rate, in turn, is determined by the requirement that total labor demand, total employment, equals total labor supply. This equilibrium condition for labor is represented in this equation. So far we have examined the following aspects of the specific factors model. First, the determination of production possibilities given an economy's resources and technology. And second, the determination of resource allocation, production, and relative prices in a market economy. If the relative price had moved in the opposite direction and the relative price of clothes, for example, had decreased, then the predictions would be reserved. Capital owners would be worse off and landowners would be better off. The change in the welfare of workers would again be ambiguous because their real wage in terms of clothes would rise, but their real wage in terms of food would fall. The effect of a relative price change on the distribution of income can be summarized as follows. The factor specific to the sector whose relative price increases is definitely better off. And vice versa, the factor specific to the sector whose relative price decreases is definitely worse off. And lastly, the change in welfare for the mobile factor is ambiguous. We just saw how changes in relative prices have strong repercussions for the distribution of income, creating both winners and losers. We now want to link this relative price change with international trade and match up the predictions for winners and losers with the trade orientation of a sector. For trade to take place, a country must face a world relative price that is different from the relative price that would prevail in the absence of trade. If opening up to trade had been associated with a decrease in the relative price of clothes, then the changing in a relative supply and demand would be reversed, and the economy would become a food exporter and a clothes importer. We can summarize both cases with the intuitive prediction that when opening up to trade, an economy exports the good whose relative price has increased and imports the good whose relative price has decreased. We have seen how production possibilities are determined by resources and technology, how the choice of what to produce is determined by the relative price of clothes, how changes in the relative price of clothes affect the real incomes of different factors of production, and how trade affects both relative prices and the economy's response to those price changes. Now we can ask the crucial question: who gains and who loses from international trade? We begin by asking how the welfare of particular groups is affected, and then how trade affects the welfare of the country as a whole. To assess the effects of trade on particular groups, the key point is that international trade shifts the relative price of the goods that are traded. We just saw in the previous part that opening to trade will increase the relative price of the good in the new export sector. We can link this prediction with our results regarding how relative price changes translate into changes in the distribution of income. More specifically, we can see that the specific factor in the sector whose relative price increases will gain, and that the specific factor in the other sector whose relative price decreases will lose. We also saw that the welfare changes for the mobile factor are ambiguous. The general outcome then is simple. Trade benefits the factor that is specific to the export sector of each country, but hurts the factor specific to the import competing sectors with ambiguous effects on mobile factors. To illustrate that trade is a source of potential gain for everyone, we proceed in 3 steps. First, we notice that in the absence of trade, the economy would have to produce what it consumed and vice versa. Thus, the consumption of the economy in the absence of trade would have to be a point on the production possibility frontier. That's a typical pre-trade consumption point. Next, we notice that it is possible for a trading economy to consume more of both goods than it would have in the absence of trade. The budget constraint represents all the possible combinations of 2 products that a country could consume given the world relative price of one of them. Part of the budget constraint, the part in one region, represents situations in which the economy consumes more of both goods than it could in the absence of trade. And finally, observe that if the economy as a whole consumes more of both goods, then it is possible in principle to give each individual more of both goods. This would make everyone better off. This shows then that it is possible to ensure that everyone is better off as a result of trade. Of course, everyone might be even better off if they had less of one good and more of the other, but this only reinforces the conclusion that everyone has the potential to gain from trade. But be careful here that everyone could gain from the trade. Unfortunately, doesn't mean that everyone actually does. In the real world, the presence of losers as well as winners from trade is one of the most important reasons why trade is not free. International trade often has strong effects on the distribution of income with countries, so that it often produces losers as well as winners. Income distribution effects arise for 2 reasons. Factors of production can't move instantaneously and costlessly from one industry to another, and changes in an economy's output mix have differential effects on the demand for different factors of production. Second, a useful model of income distribution effects of international trade is the specific factors model. It allows for a distinction between general purpose factors that can move between sectors and factors that are specific to particular uses. In this model, differences in resources can cause countries to have different relative supply curves and thus cause international trade. 3. In the specific factors model, factors specific to export sectors in each country gain from trade, while factors specific to import competing sectors lose. Mobile factors that can work in either sector may either gain or lose. 4. Trade nonetheless produces overall gains in the limited sense that those who gain could in principle compensate those who lose, while still remaining better off than before. 5. Most economists do not regard the effects of international trade on income distribution a good reason to limit this trade. In its distributional effects, trade is no different from many other forms of economic change, which are not normally regulated. Furthermore, economists would prefer to address the problem of income distribution directly rather than by interfering with trade flows. Number 6. Nonetheless, in the actual politics of trade policy, income distribution is of crucial importance. This is true in particular because those who lose from the trade are usually a much more informed, cohesive, and organized group than those who gain. 7. International factor movements can sometimes substitute for trade. So it's not surprising that international migration of labor is similar in its causes and effects to international trade. Labor moves from countries where it is abundant to countries where it is scarce. This movement raises total world output, but it also generates strong income distribution effects so that some groups are hurt as a result. If labor were the only factor of production, as the Ricardian model assumes, comparative advantage could arise only because of international differences in labor productivity. In the real world, however, while trade is partly explained by differences in labor productivity, it also reflects differences in countries' resources. Canada exports forest products to the United States, not because its lumberjacks are more productive relative to their US counterparts, but because sparsely populated Canada has more forested land per capita than the United States. Thus, a realistic view of trade must allow for the importance not just of labor, but also of other factors of production such as land, capital, and mineral resources. To explain the role of resource differences in trade, we will examine a model in which resources differences are the only source of trade. This model shows that comparative advantage is influenced by the international interaction between nations' resources, the relative abundance of factors of production, and the technology of production, which influences the relatively intensity with which different factors of production are used in the production of different goods. This actual model also looks at long-run outcomes when all factors of production are mobile across sectors. This model was developed by two Swedish economists, Elie Heckscher and Bertil Ohlin. Ohlin received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1977. The theory is often referred to as the Heckscher-Ohlin theory. Because the theory emphasizes the interplay between the proportions in which different factors of production are available in different countries and the proportions in which they are used in producing different goods, it is also referred to as the factor proportions theory. To develop the factor proportions theory, we begin by describing an economy that doesn't trade and then ask what happens when two such economies trade with each other. Since the factor proportions theory is both an important and a controversial theory, we conclude our lesson with a discussion of the empirical evidence for and against the theory. The simplest version of this model, sometimes referred to as 2 by 2 by 2, two countries, two goods, two factors of production. To keep things simple, we model a single additional factor that we call capital, which is used in conjunction with labor to produce either first or second good in this model. In the long run, both capital and labor can move across sectors, thus equalizing their returns, rental rate and wage. in both sectors. In long run, are now both goods mobile, specific to each sector, are also mobile. So as we noted, in a two-factor model, producers may have a room for choice in the use of inputs. A farmer, for example, can choose between using relatively more mechanized equipment, capital, and fewer workers, or vice versa. Thus, the farmer can choose how much labor and capital to use per unit of output produced. In each sector, then, producers will face not fixed input requirements, as in the Ricardian model, but trade-offs, like the one in the Heckscher all-in model. In Heckscher all-in model, there are trade-offs and alternative input combinations, which are used in production. What input choice will producers actually make? It depends on the relative costs of capital and labor. If capital rental rates are high and wages low, farmers will choose to produce using relatively little capital and a lot of labor. On the other hand, if the rental rates are low and wages high, they will save on labor and use a lot more capital. Suppose for a moment that the economy produces both clothes and food. This needs to be the case if the economy engages in international trade, because it might specialize completely in producing one good or the other. But let us temporarily ignore this possibility. Then competition among producers in each sector will ensure that the price of each good equals its cost of production. The cost of producing a good depends on factor prices. If wages rise, then other things equal to the price of any good whose production uses labor will also rise. The importance of particular factors' price to the cost of producing a good depends, however, on how much of that factor the goods production involves. If food production makes use of very little labor, for example, then a rise in the wage will not have much effect on the price of food. Whereas if clothes production uses a great deal of labor, a rise in the wage will have a large effect on the price. We can now complete the description of a two-factor economy by describing the relationship between goods prices, factor supplies, and output. In particular, we investigate how changes in resources, the total supply of factor, affect the allocation of factors across sectors and the associated changes in output produced. The biased effect of increases in resources on production possibilities is the key to understanding how differences in resources give rise to international trade. An increase in the supply of labor expands production possibilities disproportionately in the direction of one-factor production, while the increase in the supply of capital expands them disproportionately in the direction of the other factor production. Thus, an economy with a high relative supply of labor to capital will be relatively better at producing one factor than an economy with a low relative supply of labor to capital. Generally, an economy will tend to be relatively effective at producing goods that are intensive in the factors with which the country is relatively well endowed. Empirically confirmed, a country's resources changes lead to growth that is strongly biased toward the sectors that intensively use the factor whose supply has increased. Remember Heckscher all-in theorem. The country that is abundant in a factor exports the good whose production is intensive in that factor. In the more realistic case with multiple countries, not only two as in this model, factors of production, more factors than two, and numbers of goods, more than two, we can generalize this result as a correlation between a country's abundance in a factor and its exports of goods that use the factor intensively. Countries tend to export goods whose production is intensive in factors with which the countries are abundantly endowed. We have just discussed how trade induces a convergence of relative prices. Previously, we saw that changes in relative prices in turn have strong effects on the relative earnings of labor and capital. A rise in the price of one factor raises the purchasing power of labor in terms of both goods, while lowering the purchasing power of other factor in terms of both goods. The resource of which a country has a relatively large supply, for example labor in home and capital in foreign country, is the abundant factor in that country. And the resource of which it has a relatively small supply, capital in home and labor in foreign, is the scarce factor. The general conclusion about the income distribution effects of international trade in the long run is owners of a country's abundant factors gain from trade. Owners of a country's scarce factors lose from trade. In the absence of trade, labor would earn less in home than in foreign, and capital would earn more. Without trade, labor-abundant home would have a lower relative price of clothes than capital-abundant foreign, and the difference in relative prices of goods implies an even larger difference in the relative prices of factors. Thus, there is clearly a tendency toward equalization of factor prices. How far does this tendency go? The surprising answer is that in the model, the tendency goes all the way. International trade leads to complete equalization of factor prices. Let's summarize. 1. To understand the role of resources in trade, we developed a model in which two goods are produced using two factors of production. The two goods differ in their factory intensity, that is, at any given wage-rental ratio, production of one of the goods will use a higher ratio of capital to labor than production of the other. 2. As long as a country produces both goods, there is one-to-one relationship between the relative prices of goods and the relative prices of factors used to produce the goods. A rise in the relative price of the labor-intense good will shift the distribution of income in favor of labor, and will do so very strongly. The real wage of labor will rise in terms of both goods, while the real income of capital owners will fall in terms of both goods. 3. An increase in the supply of one factor of production expands production possibilities, but in a strongly biased way. At unchanged relative goods prices, the output of the good intensive in that factor rises, while the output of the other good actually falls. 4. A country that has a large supply of one resource relative to its supply of other resource is abundant in that resource. A country will tend to produce relatively more of goods that use its abundant resources intensively. The results, basic actual in theory of trade says, countries tend to export goods that are intensive in the factors with which they are abundantly supplied. 5. Because changes in relative prices of goods have very strong effects on the relative earnings of resources, and because trade changes relative prices, international trade has strong income distribution effects. The owners of a country's abundant factors gain from trade, but the owners of scarce factors lose. In theory, however, there are still gains from trade, in the limited sense that the winner could compensate the losers, and everyone would be better off. 6. In an idealized model, international trade would actually lead to equalization of the prices of factors, such as labor and capital between countries. In reality, complete factor price equalization is not observed because of wide differences in countries, barriers to trade, and international differences in technology. 7. Empirical evidence is mixed on the Heckscher-Ohlin model, but most researchers do not believe that differences in resources alone can explain the pattern of world trade or world factor prices. Instead, it seems to be necessary to allow for substantial international differences in technology. Nonetheless, the Heckscher-Ohlin model does a good job of predicting the pattern of trade between developed and developing countries.
At the end, there is just to say subscribe and give me likes. See you soon!